Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital Today channel. Michael's footsteps echoed down the polished hallway of General Hospital as he made his way toward the nurse's station for yet another follow-up on the burns that still itched beneath his bandages, a physical reminder of everything that had spiraled out of control in recent weeks, though the real scars were emotional and rooted deep in the chaos that Willow and Drew had unleashed on the entire family. Liz greeted him with a clipboard in hand and offered a sympathetic smile that only made his frustration simmer hotter beneath the surface, especially when she gently informed him that Willow had been placed on administrative leave until her trial, a trial that loomed like a shadow over everything and everyone, and then, almost casually, Liz added that Willow had moved out and back in with Drew, the man who, in Michael's mind, had systematically dismantled her judgment, her priorities, her entire sense of responsibility. Michael barely managed to swallow an incredulous laugh as he muttered that this was just another in Willow's long, exhausting line of bad decisions. He accused Drew, at least in theory, of convincing Willow to move in purely to garner sympathy from the jury, because Drew knew how to play optics and narratives and knew exactly how to frame himself as the devoted partner protecting the fragile mother unfairly accused. Liz countered with a suggestion Michael should have expected but still bristled at. She gently pointed out that if Michael really believed Drew was manipulating Willow, then perhaps offering Willow access to her kids again would be the one move that could pull her out of Drew's orbit, because whatever else Willow had messed up, she had always loved her kids. But Michael shook his head with icy resolve. He insisted that Willow had been handed chance after chance to put her children first and she had failed every single time, and although it sounded harsh, his responsibility was to protect his kids from Willow's instability and Drew's manipulative influence. He went so far as to say that his children deserved a better mother than one who was currently on trial for attempted murder, and Liz flinched at the bluntness even as she understood his conviction, because this was not the same Michael who used to bend over backward for Willow. This was a man exhausted, hardened, and determined to keep chaos away from his kids at any cost. Across town, Willow arrived at Drew's sprawling home with her suitcase rolling behind her, each step feeling heavier than the last, and when Drew hobbled out on his cane to greet her, she could see the physical pain in his posture but also the emotional insistence in his eyes as he asked how it felt to be home. She swallowed hard and admitted she didn't even know what home meant anymore because this once beautiful house now felt tainted by everything that had happened, every argument, every accusation, every moment of fear. And she couldn't understand how Drew could still live there without feeling suffocated by the memories. Drew, ever the optimist when it came to her, brushed aside the notion and told her that thinking about her, about what she meant to him, was what allowed him to breathe inside these walls, and if the house truly weighed her down, then he would buy them a new one without hesitation. His dedication should have comforted her, yet Willow's heart was a storm of worry and doubt. She confessed that she was overwhelmed by the pressure of the impending trial, the constant scrutiny, and the fact that Michael and Sonny controlled large swaths of Port Charles, which meant that if they wanted her found guilty, they had the resources and connections to make sure that outcome became reality. Drew stepped closer, steady and unwavering despite the limp that slowed him, and asked if her anxiety meant she was having second thoughts about being with him, because he could handle anything except the thought of losing her. Willow shook her head and insisted that she did want a future with him, truly, but she was terrified that future would be snatched away before it began because she might end up behind bars long before she had a chance to rebuild her life. Drew countered with fierce certainty that she would be found innocent, that the truth would clear her name, and that Michael's influence was not as powerful as she feared. He promised her that love and loyalty still mattered in this town. Then, to Willow's utter shock, Drew slowly lowered himself onto one knee, gritting through the pain the movement caused his injured leg, and began pouring out a heartfelt speech about how deeply he loved her and her children, how he believed in the life they were building together, and how standing beside her in court as her husband would send a message to the jury that she was not a dangerous woman but a devoted partner and mother with someone solid in her corner. Willow's breath caught in her throat and tears burned her eyes because every other time she had been married, she had done so because circumstances forced her hand, marrying Chase because of his illness, marrying Michael for Wiley's custody, and she had always dreamed that her next marriage would be for the right reasons, reasons rooted in genuine love and hope rather than desperation. Drew insisted that this proposal was for the right reason, unless the problem was that she no longer loved him. Willow reached for him automatically, telling him she did love him, but she couldn't shake the worry that accepting his proposal now, so close to her trial, would look like another strategic maneuver instead of a true declaration of love. Drew remained on his knee, waiting, breathing hard, wounded not physically but emotionally by the weight of uncertainty on her face. Meanwhile, at the Port Charles Grill, Nina arrived with a freshly cropped haircut that framed her features more sharply than before, making her look both fierce and vulnerable. She joined Albrecht at a secluded table, where her aunt wasted no time launching into a request that Nina use Crimson to publish a glowing, sympathetic piece about Rocco, a boy Albrecht insisted had been wronged by the justice system and needed public support. Nina, visibly exhausted by the constant emotional strain of the situation, told her aunt that Lulu would be a much better choice, considering Lulu was Rocco's mother and had the moral authority Nina lacked. With a trembling voice, Nina added that Rocco had an entire village around him, family members, allies, protectors, while Willow had no one except Drew, who was doing everything he could but was still just one person standing against the tidal wave of public judgment. Nina confessed she had only just learned Willow had moved back in with Drew, something that left her feeling helpless, frustrated, and guilty because, no matter what Willow claimed, Nina still felt responsible for her daughter's suffering. Albrecht, never one to mince words, subtly brought up Nina's so-called airtight alibi, the one Nina had clung to earlier, and warned her niece that every time Nina tried to fix things for Willow, she ended up making them worse, especially when her attempts involved secrets and questionable choices. Nina's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her wineglass, and she finally broke down and admitted that she had done something she desperately regretted, something she had attempted in a misguided effort to protect Willow from the fallout of Drew's shooting. Albrecht's eyes narrowed, connecting dots that had been circling her mind for days, and she leaned forward with chilling calm as she asked whether Nina had shot Drew in some twisted attempt to keep him from dragging Willow deeper into the legal nightmare. Nina froze, tears pooling, panic rising in her throat because Albrecht had hit dangerously close to the truth, not that Nina had actually shot Drew, but that she had inserted herself into the situation in ways she should never have contemplated, and now the possibility that Albrecht believed she was capable of such an act only heightened Nina's fear that she truly was a danger to the people she loved. Across town, another storm was brewing as Nathan stepped out of the courthouse with a mix of exhaustion and triumph etched across his face. He had spent days navigating red tape, legal loopholes, and apathetic officials to secure Rocco's release from juvenile detention, and despite being dismissed repeatedly as merely an officer with limited authority, Nathan had persisted until he finally forced the system to acknowledge that Rocco had been processed unfairly. The moment he signed the final release forms and watched the guard escort Rocco out, Nathan felt the first real breath of relief he'd had in weeks. And when Rocco rushed into his arms, shaking, emotional, and grateful, Nathan understood just how deeply the situation had traumatized the boy. Rocco clung to him, stammering that he thought he would never get out, that everyone said he was a troublemaker, that he would be locked away until he turned 18, and Nathan crouched down, rested both hands on Rocco's shoulders, and promised him that none of that would ever happen again, not while he had breath left in his body. As the threads of these stories wove together across Port Charles, tension simmered everywhere. Michael steeled himself for the custody battle he knew was coming. Willow stood trembling in front of a man on one knee, torn between love and fear. Drew remained determined to show her the future he believed they deserved. Nina spiraled under the weight of guilt and suspicion. Albrecht raised an eyebrow, unconvinced by Nina's denials, and Nathan prepared to reunite Rocco with a family desperate to hold him close. Decisions hung in the air like storm clouds, some born of love, others of fear, and some of pure desperation, and the next choices these characters made would ripple across the entire city, binding some together while tearing others apart. In the eye of it all stood Willow, a woman being pulled by loyalty, guilt, love, fear, and responsibility, staring down a proposal that was both a lifeline and a chain, while somewhere in the shadows, Nina's secrets threatened to ignite a firestorm that could consume not only Drew's shooting investigation but the fragile bond she still hoped, desperately, foolishly, to rebuild with the daughter she had already lost once before. The wind picked up over Port Charles as dusk settled across the skyline, painting the buildings in streaks of gold and violet as though the entire city was caught between two worlds, one fading, one beginning. And it was in that strange in-between light that Willow felt the weight of Drew's proposal press more heavily against her heart. She stood frozen before him, her hands trembling, her breath uneven, her mind spiraling through every choice that had led her to this moment. Drew, still kneeling on the polished floor despite the strain on his injured leg, watched her with eyes full of hope, fear, and unwavering devotion. His fingers tightened subtly around the velvet box, not in impatience but in determination, as though he could physically hold the moment together until she was ready to give him her answer. To Willow, time seemed to slow, the ticking of the clock on the mantel growing louder and louder, almost drowning out the sounds of her own pulse hammering in her ears. She thought of the first time Drew had told her he loved her, how safe she had felt, how sure she had been that he saw her as more than just a broken woman trying to survive her past. He had seen her strength, her compassion, her resilience. But now, standing on the brink of a trial that could destroy her life, she questioned whether marrying him would be a declaration of love or a plea for stability in a world spinning out of control. Her voice shook as she told him she needed a moment to think, and Drew nodded with a softness that pierced her. He promised he wasn't trying to trap her into a decision, wasn't trying to use her fear as leverage, but he couldn't deny that standing beside her in court as her husband would make a difference, not because of optics, but because the jurors would see her as someone cherished, supported, believed in. Willow let out a shaky breath and walked to the window, staring out at the fading city lights, wondering how her life had descended into this tangled web of love, fear, and legal chaos. She remembered the days when her world had revolved around Wiley's laughter, quiet mornings with Michael, and the steady routine of nursing shifts. She remembered feeling grounded, hopeful, safe. Now she felt like a woman standing on shifting sand, every decision threatening to pull her deeper into uncertainty. Behind her, Drew remained kneeling until she turned, and only then did he rise, carefully, wincing but refusing help. He told her that no matter what she decided, yes, no, or not yet, he wasn't going anywhere. That promise, simple as it was, made Willow's eyes fill again, her emotions tipping dangerously toward breaking. Meanwhile, Michael left the hospital with his jaw clenched and his mind spinning, the sterile smell of antiseptic still lingering in his clothes as he stepped into the cool evening air. Every word Liz had said replayed in his head, especially the insinuation that he could have swayed Willow with access to the kids. It gnawed at him, not because Liz was wrong, but because she might have been right, and Michael hated how complicated everything had become. He unlocked his car but didn't get in immediately, leaning against the frame as he tried to steady his breathing. He hated feeling like the villain in Willow's story, hated that she painted him as the enemy while Drew, whose decisions had hurt so many people, was somehow the hero. A passing nurse nodded politely as she walked to her car, and Michael forced a tight smile, not wanting his inner turmoil on display. He tried to remind himself that protecting Wiley and Amelia was his only priority, that no matter what Willow or anyone else thought, limiting her access was the safest choice for them. But a part of him, buried beneath layers of anger and disappointment, whispered that maybe he was still reacting to his own hurt, his own sense of betrayal. He shook the thought away violently. No, he told himself. This wasn't about feelings. This was about safeguarding innocent children. That had to matter more than the messiness of adult emotions. Back at the Port Charles Grill, Nina and Albrecht's conversation was growing taut, the tension between them thickening with every passing second. Nina's hands trembled as she dabbed her eyes with a napkin, her breathing ragged, her thoughts scattered like broken glass across her mind. Albrecht watched her with an unsettling mixture of sympathy and analytical scrutiny, her sharp gaze searching Nina's face for truth or lies. She asked again, more quietly, more pointedly, whether Nina had shot Drew. The question sliced through Nina like a blade, sharper for the emotional exhaustion already fraying her edges. Nina shook her head rapidly, insisting no, she hadn't fired the gun, she hadn't pulled that trigger, she hadn't physically harmed Drew. But she faltered when Albrecht asked the real question, what had she done? Because Nina's alibi had gaps, not in time but in intention. She had intervened, interfered, inserted herself into the chaos in ways she had sworn she wouldn't. She had listened to conversations she shouldn't have, influenced people she had no right to influence, and made assumptions that had spiraled beyond her control. The more Albrecht pushed, the more Nina crumbled, her guilt oozing through every word even as she denied the worst of her aunt's suspicions. In her desperation to protect Willow, she had become reckless in a way that reminded Albrecht far too much of a younger, more volatile Nina from years past, the one who had stolen children, crossed boundaries, and blurred lines between love and obsession. Albrecht leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the table thoughtfully, a storm brewing behind her eyes. She didn't believe Nina had shot Drew, at least, not with her own hands. But she wasn't convinced Nina hadn't played some role, directly or indirectly, in the events leading up to his shooting. And Nina's refusal to address the specifics only deepened her suspicion. Still, beneath her stern exterior, Albrecht's concern for her niece flickered, though she kept her voice firm as she warned Nina that secrets had a way of clawing their way to the surface no matter how deeply one tried to bury them. Across town, Nathan walked with Rocco through the Jibby exit doors, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as the guard handed over the boys' personal belongings. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, old sneakers, and institutional fatigue. Rocco kept close to Nathan, his normally bold demeanor subdued, his shoulders tense, his eyes darting warily as though afraid someone would pull him back inside at the last second. Nathan placed a reassuring hand on the boy's back and guided him toward the exit, where the air felt fresher and the world surprisingly louder. Cars honked in the distance, the wind rustled trees, and a group of teenagers laughed across the street. To Rocco, the noise was almost overwhelming after the suffocating silence of locked doors and strict routines. Nathan crouched beside him in the parking lot, leveling their heights, and gently told him he was safe now, that whatever mistakes he may have made, he didn't deserve to have his life upended by a system that too often punished children instead of helping them. Rocco whispered that he had felt forgotten, like everyone had moved on without him, and Nathan shook his head firmly, telling him that no one forgot him, not for a minute, and he had fought tirelessly to bring him home. As they stood, Lulu's car pulled into the lot, the headlights washing over them. When Lulu stepped out, tears already streaming down her face, Rocco ran to her with the force of a boy who had been holding his breath for days. She dropped to her knees and embraced him tightly, her shoulders shaking as she kissed his hair, whispered his name, and promised him that he would never be alone again. Nathan watched the reunion with a mix of relief and pride. This was why he pushed through the bureaucracy, why he refused to accept the system's cold indifference. Lulu looked up at him with gratitude so deep it left her momentarily speechless, and Nathan simply nodded, knowing words weren't needed. Rocco was home. That was all that mattered. Back in Drew's living room, Willow finally turned from the window with a heaviness in her chest that made it hard to breathe. Drew stood a few feet away, not touching her, not pressuring her, simply waiting with a patience she didn't deserve. She admitted softly that she didn't know if saying yes right now would be about love or about fear, and she couldn't live with the thought of tainting their relationship by making a choice rooted in panic. Drew stepped closer, gently cupping her cheek, and told her that love could exist even in fear, that their lives were already threaded with challenges and heartbreak, and trying to wait for a perfect moment would be like waiting for a storm-free season in Port Charles. They simply didn't exist. But he also promised he didn't want her love if she felt coerced by circumstances. He didn't want to be her refuge, he wanted to be her partner. Willow felt herself crumble under the tenderness in his voice, and she whispered that she needed time, real time, to sit with the proposal, to breathe, to find her footing before she made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. Drew nodded, kissed her forehead, and told her that whatever answer she ultimately gave, he would accept it because he loved her enough to let her choose with clarity rather than desperation. As she stepped into the guest room to unpack, Drew exhaled slowly, the ache in his leg throbbing in rhythm with the ache in his heart. He walked to the couch, sank down with a sigh, and whispered a quiet prayer to whatever force might be listening that the woman he loved would choose him not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Across the city, Nina stared out the window of the restaurant after Albrecht left, her food untouched, her heart pounding, her mind racing through every secret she'd kept, every half-truth she'd told. Her reflection in the glass looked older, wearier, more fragile. She had tried to be better. She had tried to be a mother, tried to be supportive, tried to protect Willow from the shadows of her past. But somehow, everything she touched seemed to break. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, and she clutched her napkin in shaking hands, whispering that she only wanted to help, but even she no longer believed her own excuses. And on another street, Michael finally climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he stared through the windshield at nothing in particular. He didn't know it yet, but the decisions he made in the coming days, choices rooted in fear, love, anger, and desperation, would collide with Willow's, with Drew's, with Nina's, creating a chain reaction that would shake Port Charles to its core. None of them knew it yet, but the storm was coming. And every one of them stood in its path.